Get comfortable. Adjust the pillow. Turn the screen brightness down if you haven't already, or just close your eyes and let the voice carry you. Tonight we are going somewhere familiar. Springfield. The town that has existed on American television since before most of the people watching this were old enough to have an opinion about television. The town with the yellow sky and the cracked cooling towers, and the impossibly patient blue-haired woman at the kitchen counter, and the family on the couch that never quite changes no matter how many years pass outside its walls. You know The Simpsons. This is not a bold claim to make. The Simpsons is one of those properties that has achieved the rare and specific kind of cultural saturation where knowing it requires no active effort. It has been present long enough and loudly enough that it has simply become part of the atmospheric condition of growing up in the English-speaking world over the last 3.5 decades. 36 seasons, more than 780 episodes, the longest-running American animated series, the longest-running American sitcom, the longest-running scripted primetime program in the history of American television, full stop, and the record keeps extending each year the show continues. But here is the thing about The Simpsons that most people who know it casually have never quite reckoned with. It is not just a long show, it is a deep show. It has accumulated, over its extraordinary run, a kind of layered complexity that most entertainment properties never come close to developing, because most entertainment properties do not run long enough for the layers to form. The Simpsons has had time, enormous quantities of time, and in that time, it has built something underneath the jokes and the couch gags and the catchphrases that the casual viewer never sees, and that even the dedicated viewer can spend years watching without fully registering. Tonight we are going to see it. What we are doing tonight is descending. We are going to take the full shape of The Simpsons, everything the show contains, its history and its mysteries and its buried storylines and its unresolved threads, and the theories that the fan community has built with decades of careful attention, and we are going to move through it layer by layer, from the surface down to the very bottom of what the iceberg holds. The Simpsons Iceberg is a concept that has existed in fan communities for years. If you have never encountered it, the basic idea is this. Imagine a chart in the shape of an iceberg, with the water line running through the middle. Above the water, the things that most people who watch the show already know. Below it, organized by depth, the things that become progressively more obscure, more specific, more surprising, and ultimately more revealing as you go down. The stuff at the very top is common knowledge. The stuff at the very bottom is the kind of thing that changes how the entire surface looks once you know it is there. We are going to cover all of it, every major layer, and we are going to take our time with each one, because rushing through an iceberg misses the point. The depth is the point. The patience required to reach the depth is part of what the depth rewards. So settle in. Get the blanket arranged how you want it. Let the familiar sounds of Springfield settle around you. The music, the yellow, the way the show opens every single week with that same couch gag, that same family, that same house. We have been watching this house for 36 years. Tonight we are going to finally look at what is underneath it. Section 1. The surface level. What everyone knows. The Simpsons premiered on the 17th of December, 1989. That fact, sitting there plainly, should do something to you if you think about it for a moment. The 17th of December, 1989. The Berlin Wall had fallen 5 weeks earlier. The Cold War was in the process of ending in real time. The internet, in the form that most people alive today have experienced it, did not yet exist. A mobile phone was a large, heavy object that wealthy people kept in their cars. The idea that you would one day carry a small glass rectangle in your pocket capable of accessing all human knowledge would have registered as science fiction to most of the people watching that first episode. And in the middle of all of that, on Fox, a fledgling network still assembling its identity, a cartoon about a yellow family in a fictional American town began its run. Homer, Marge, Bart, Lisa, Maggie. A nuclear family in the most precise and literal sense. The father works at a nuclear power plant living at 742 Evergreen Terrace in Springfield, somewhere in the United States of America, doing the things that American families are supposed to do. The father goes to work, the mother manages the house, the children go to school, they sit together at dinner, they disagree and reconcile and make mistakes and try again. The rhythms of their life are recognizable, which was the point. Matt Groening, who created the show, wanted something that felt familiar enough to invite identification and strange enough to generate comedy from the gap between the familiar ideal and the reality underneath it. What the show produced in its first few seasons was a kind of comedy that American television had not quite done before. It was satirical without being mean. It was warm without being naive. It understood that the American family, as actually lived rather than as idealized, was full of specific, recognizable, not entirely comfortable truths about the gap between what parents want for their children and what they are capable of providing, about the way institutions like schools and workplaces and churches serve their own needs as often as they serve the people nominally inside them, about the exhaustion of the person in the family who holds everything together and receives the least acknowledgement for doing so. The show built this understanding into the bones of its comedy. The jokes were not just jokes. They were jokes in the service of a portrait. And the portrait was of a specific kind of American life that had never been depicted on television with quite this combination of honesty and affection. Within 2 years of its premiere, The Simpsons was the most culturally significant show on American television. Bart Simpson was on the cover of magazines. The phrase, "don't have a cow, man," had entered common usage in schools and offices and conversations that had nothing to do with the show. The merchandise was everywhere. The backlash from parents and school administrators who worried about Bart's influence on actual children was, paradoxically, the most effective advertising the show could have hoped for, because it signaled to the audience that this was something the official culture found threatening, which meant it was something worth paying attention to. Sang at BB. What made it threatening was honesty. The Simpsons, in its early seasons, was honest about things that American family television had typically not been honest about. Homer was not a wise father whose foibles were endearing. He was a man whose limitations were real and whose limitations had real consequences for the people around him. Marge was not a cheerfully domestic woman fulfilled by housework. She was a capable person whose capability was being consumed by the management of everyone else's needs, with no particular acknowledgement of the cost. Bart was not a good-hearted scamp. He was a child in genuine distress about his academic situation, processing that distress through behavior that was easier to perform than the vulnerability the distress required. Lisa was not a precocious charmer. She was a genuinely gifted child in an environment poorly equipped to support what she was, and the friction between her gifts and her environment was drawn without the reassurance that it would resolve itself. These were real things, recognizable things, things that the people watching at home in December 1989 understood from their own lives. Even if the yellow skin and the four fingers and the town called Springfield made the packaging unmistakably fictional. That is the surface of the iceberg. That is what the show is. In the reading available to anyone who has watched it with reasonable attention. A satire, a portrait, a comedy about the American family that is also, somewhat below its own surface, an argument about the American family. Now, here is where the iceberg concept becomes useful. The Simpsons has been running for 36 years. In that time, it has produced a body of work so large, so internally complex, so densely self-referential, and so studded with buried detail, unresolved storyline, production mystery, and quietly accumulated meaning that the surface reading satire, portrait, argument about the American family is genuinely only the beginning. The show contains significantly more than its surface presence, and the more has been there since the beginning, growing more elaborate and more interconnected with every passing season. The iceberg exists to map it. An iceberg, for those unfamiliar with the format, is a visual chart that organizes material by depth. The most commonly known items are at the top, above the waterline where anyone can see them, below the waterline, organized into layers that go progressively deeper, are items that become increasingly obscure, increasingly specific, and increasingly revelatory as you descend. The format has been applied to many cultural properties, video games, films, historical events, but The Simpsons is one of the properties where the format works with unusual precision because the show has genuinely accumulated the depth that the iceberg structure requires. Some of the items in The Simpsons Iceberg are simply production trivia. Facts about the show's development, decisions that were made in the writer's room, cast changes and voice actor stories, and the specific circumstances under which certain episodes were produced. This material is interesting to fans but does not fundamentally change how you experience the show. Some of the items are more significant. Storylines that the show introduced and then never resolved. Episodes that were pulled from rotation after real-world events made their content too uncomfortable to broadcast. Creative decisions that, in retrospect, marked the beginning of the show's gradual departure from what had made it extraordinary in its first years. And some of the items, the deepest ones, the ones at the very bottom of the chart, are things that reframe the entire show once you know them. Arguments that the show has been making for 3.5 decades, embedded in its choices and its patterns and its specific ways of repeatedly returning to the same material that are not visible unless you have been paying very close attention for a very long time, or unless someone has assembled the accumulated evidence into a shape you can see all at once. That is what we are doing tonight. We are assembling the evidence. We are building the shape. Let me tell you a small thing before we go deeper, just to establish what kind of attention the iceberg rewards. Homer's mother. For the first 6 seasons of The Simpsons, Homer's mother was dead. This was part of his established backstory, laid into the show's foundation early and consistently reinforced. He had grown up without her. The specific loss had shaped him in ways that the show tracked with genuine psychological precision. His desperate need for approval, his tendency to cling to the relationships he did have with an intensity that sometimes threatened those relationships, his difficulty accepting that love from the people around him was real and would not be arbitrarily withdrawn. These were drawn in the early seasons as character traits rooted in maternal loss. They made Homer legible and, in the show's best episodes, genuinely moving. A man who behaves the way Homer behaves, with the specific quality of need that Homer displays, is a man shaped by something real. The show understood this and built it carefully. And then season 7 came, and Homer's mother turned out to be alive. Not just alive, she had been alive the entire time, living underground as a political fugitive, unable to return to her family, forced away from Springfield by a specific man whose identity the show revealed, with the care of a mystery story finally delivering its answer. The same man Homer works for. The same man whose plant has been leaking into the water supply. The same man who effectively owns the entire town and whose influence extends into every corner of its institutional life. Charles Montgomery Burns drove Mona Simpson out of her son's life when Homer was a child. And Homer, as an adult, cashes a paycheck every 2 weeks signed by the same man who stole his mother from him. He does not know this. He was never told. The connection between his deepest personal loss and his daily economic situation is there, present, documented in the show's own continuity, and entirely invisible to the character at the center of it. That is the iceberg. That is what we are looking at tonight. Not just funny cartoon details hidden in the background. The structural bones of what the show is actually about, laid into the foundation so carefully that they can be 36 years in the air before someone notices them all at once. Let us begin. Before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is where you are right now. There is something I genuinely find meaningful about knowing this video is reaching people in completely different parts of the world, at completely different hours. Some of you just starting your evening, some of you deep into the night, some of you somewhere in between. And if you have not subscribed yet, right now is a good moment to do that. We go this deep regularly and you will not want to miss what is coming. Section 2, the yellow skin problem. There is something strange about the people of Springfield that most viewers stopped consciously registering approximately 8 minutes into their first episode, and which has subsequently sat in the background of every viewing experience, unquestioned, accepted, absorbed into the baseline of what Springfield looks like and therefore what Springfield is. They are yellow. Not yellow in the way that a sunset or a dandelion or a school bus is yellow, where the yellowness is the point and demands your attention. Yellow as a baseline. Yellow as the default. The color of every resident of Springfield, regardless of age, regardless of stated background or family origin, regardless of any of the other characteristics that would normally produce variation in what human beings look like. Homer is yellow. Marge is yellow. Bart is yellow. Lisa is yellow. Ned Flanders is yellow. Chief Wiggum is yellow. Dr. Julius Hibbert, who is black by every cultural and social marker the show uses to establish his identity, is also yellow. Apu Nahasapema Petilon, who is South Asian by every marker the show uses for him, is also yellow. The entire population of Springfield, A town depicted as culturally diverse in ways that were unusual for American television in the early 1990s, shares a single impossible skin tone. The production history of this choice is documented and not particularly mysterious. Matt Groening has explained in numerous interviews that he chose yellow for the characters because it would register immediately and distinctively on television screens during the era before streaming, when channel surfing was the dominant mode of television consumption. In that era, you move through channels quickly, settling for a second or two before deciding whether to stop. Groening wanted The Simpsons to be identifiable within that second or two. A cartoon with yellow-skinned characters would catch the eye in a way that no other color choice could, because no other animation on television was using yellow as a default skin tone. The choice was strategic, aesthetic, and practical all at once. This explanation is true. It is also, when you begin examining the show at the iceberg level, the beginning of something rather than the end of it. Because the production history of a choice tells you why the choice was made. It does not tell you what the choice accumulated over 36 years of use. And this distinction matters enormously for the iceberg, which is fundamentally interested in what choices accumulate rather than only in why choices were made. Here is what the yellow skin accumulated. The show has always drawn Springfield residents differently from characters who come from outside Springfield. This is not a subtle observation. It is something that careful viewers have been documenting since the early seasons, and that the show itself has occasionally acknowledged by making jokes about. When a celebrity appears in Springfield, and The Simpsons has featured an extraordinary number of celebrity cameos across its run, they tend to look different from the local population. Their proportions are slightly more naturalistic. Their eyes are positioned on their faces with more anatomical plausibility. Their overall character design has a quality that, within the show's stylized animation framework, is meaningfully more realistic than what the regular Springfield cast receives. The production explanation for this is that the show uses design variation to help audiences distinguish recurring characters from guest appearances. If Springfield residents and visitors all looked identical, the visual vocabulary of the show would be less efficient. Visitors need to read as visitors. But within the logic of the show's own universe, what this practice produces is something worth examining carefully. There is an observable, visual, consistent difference between the people who live inside Springfield's borders and the people who come from outside them. Insiders look one way, outsiders look another way. The people of Springfield are drawn with specific exaggerations, specific disproportions, specific anatomical departures from what human beings actually look like, that are not present in the people who arrive from outside. If you are watching the show as a production artifact, this is character design. If you are watching the show as if it were a documentary record of an actual place, this is evidence that something is happening to the people inside Springfield's borders that is not happening to the people outside them. Something that has changed the population's physical appearance in consistent, measurable, visually documentable ways. Something that correlates with residents in Springfield and does not affect people who visit but do not live there. The iceberg community has spent a significant amount of time connecting this observation to the town's most prominent feature, the nuclear power plant. The Springfield nuclear power plant, which we will examine in much greater depth in a later section, has been established across hundreds of episodes as one of the most comprehensively unsafe industrial facilities in the history of fictional infrastructure. It has accumulated, in its canonical existence, an almost inconceivable record of safety failures, environmental violations, and regulatory non-compliance. Radioactive material has been documented leaving the plant through cracked cooling towers, through waste disposal practices that include dumping directly into local waterways, through failures in containment infrastructure that have been identified and left unaddressed across decades of operation. The plant has been established as a chronic and ongoing source of radioactive environmental contamination for the entire Springfield area. Chronic radiation exposure at sufficient doses over sufficient time periods does affect human biology in ways that are visible. The specific ways vary enormously depending on dose, duration, type of radiation, and individual biological factors. The yellow skin of Springfield residents does not correspond to any known specific effect of radiation exposure in the real world, which is where the theory runs up against its limitations as a strictly literal scientific claim. But the iceberg is not operating as a strictly literal scientific exercise. It is asking what the show has built across 36 years of consistent choices. And what the show has built is this: a visual system in which the people inside a heavily contaminated environment look consistently, measurably different from the people outside it. The difference is explained away, at the surface level, as an art style. The iceberg asks whether the art style and the in-universe explanation for the difference might not be the same thing, rendered simultaneously through a single production choice. There is a specific episode that the iceberg returns to repeatedly in this context because it makes the contamination biology connection as explicitly as the show ever has. In the episode The Springfield Files, which is a crossover with The X-Files, Homer encounters a figure in the woods near Springfield that he believes is an alien. The episode builds this mystery across its runtime and eventually resolves it. The figure is not an alien. It is Mr. Burns. Burns has been undergoing a weekly medical regimen so intensive, so saturated with chemical and radiological treatment that it produces in his body a visible green luminescence. After each weekly session, Burns wanders the woods in a daze, literally glowing in the dark, looking like something that does not belong to the natural world. The episode presents this as a comedy reveal, and it is funny. But what it is also doing, within the internal logic of the show's universe, is confirming that radiation in sufficient concentration does alter the physical appearance of biological organisms. Burns glows. The fish have 3 eyes. These are canonical facts about what radiation does to living things in Springfield's universe. And the iceberg asks, what has it done to the people? The yellow skin is the answer. Not stated as such, not confirmed by any writer or producer, but present, consistently, as the visual fact of what Springfield's residents look like across 36 years, in a show that has confirmed radiation's capacity to alter biological appearance through every other means available to it. There is also a dimension of the yellow skin that concerns race, and it is worth spending careful time with this because it is genuinely complicated. The Simpsons was, in its early seasons, one of the more racially diverse mainstream American animated programs. Springfield's population included Black characters, South Asian characters, Latino characters, and others whose identities were drawn from specific non-white American cultural experiences. Dr. Hibbert, Apu, Bumblebee Man, Carl Carlson, these were characters whose backgrounds were part of how the show depicted America as a place populated by a full range of people. But all of these characters share the Springfield yellow. Whatever their stated backgrounds, whatever the cultural specificity of their names and their family structures and their food and their accents and their community ties, they are drawn in the same color as Homer and Marge and Ned Flanders. The intended reading of this is a form of visual egalitarianism. By making everyone yellow, the show sidesteps the politics of representing real-world skin tones and focuses instead on character, culture, and behavior as the distinguishing features of its diverse cast. Nobody in Springfield has a skin color that maps to a real-world racial classification. Everybody is Springfield yellow, which is nobody's actual skin color, which means the visual field of the show is in this one register racially neutral. The problem with this reading is that racial neutrality in the visual field does not produce racial neutrality in the content. The characters still have names, accents, cultural practices, family structures, and social positions that correspond to real-world racial identities and their associated histories. Making them all yellow does not make those associations disappear. It makes them harder to see directly, which is not the same thing as resolving them. The Apu controversy, which came to a head in the late 2010s following a documentary that examined the character's cultural impact on South Asian Americans, is the clearest example of this tension. The documentary argued that the character had functioned for decades as a vehicle for stereotype, providing non-South Asian viewers with a convenient cultural shorthand for an entire community that was both reductive and, in many cases, actively harmful to the people it supposedly represented. This argument was made despite and partly because of the show's stated affection for the character and the genuine attachment many South Asian viewers had to Apu as one of the only South Asian characters in mainstream American animation. The yellow skin was not a defense in this context. The fact that Apu shared his skin tone with Homer Simpson did not change what the character's portrayal communicated about South Asian identity. The visual neutrality of the shared yellow was not the same as cultural neutrality in the content. The show eventually retired the character, declining to recast after the voice actor associated with the role stepped down, acknowledging that something in how the character had been handled required more than a cosmetic response. This episode in the show's cultural history is iceberg material in the specific sense that it reveals something about what the yellow skin's apparent neutrality was actually doing. It was creating the appearance of a level visual playing field, while the content below the surface was operating according to a different logic. The iceberg holds this alongside everything else it holds about the yellow skin. The production decision, the contamination theory, the racial politics, the 36 years of audiences absorbing yellow Springfield residents and outsiders who look different, all of it pointing toward the same conclusion. The yellow skin is where the show tells you, without ever quite saying so, that the people of Springfield are not ordinary people. Something has happened to them. Something that makes them look different from the people who come from outside. Something that has been happening for so long that they no longer notice it, and neither does the audience. And that invisibility is precisely the mechanism by which it has been allowed to continue. The most effective contaminations are the ones you stop being able to see. Section 3. The nuclear plant and what it has done. The Springfield nuclear power plant sits on a hill visible from most of the town. 2 large cooling towers. A building complex beneath them. The familiar logo on the side that has appeared in the background of hundreds of establishing shots across 36 seasons, so consistent a feature of Springfield's skyline that it has become as much a part of the town's visual identity as the Simpson house itself. It is also, by any reasonable measurement, one of the most dangerous fictional industrial facilities ever depicted in the history of American television. And the show has been documenting this, methodically, across every single one of its seasons, without anyone in the story ever connecting the documentation into a coherent picture of what the plant has done to the town. Let us build that picture here, because the iceberg requires it. A surprise safety inspection of the plant, depicted in a canonical episode, found 342 violations. Not 342 potential areas of concern. 342 actual, documentable violations of nuclear safety standards. The estimated cost to bring the facility into compliance was $56 million. The plant's owner, Charles Montgomery Burns, declined to spend this money. Not because he lacked the funds. The show has established Burns as a billionaire many times over, a man whose personal wealth makes $56 million an almost trivially small expenditure. He declined because spending it would require acknowledging that the violations existed, and acknowledging that the violations existed would open a set of questions about what those violations had already done, over how many years, to how many people living downwind and downstream. The specific nature of the violations compounds this. The inspection did not find procedural paperwork deficiencies. It found radioactive waste being disposed of in ways that include direct dumping into local bodies of water. It found radioactive material used as a paperweight on someone's desk. It found structural failures in the cooling infrastructure that had been addressed through improvised means, including, in one canonical instance, a wad of chewing gum. It found luminous rats living in the building's infrastructure, a detail the show presents as comedic background, and which the iceberg holds as evidence of a contamination event significant enough to alter the biology of the local rodent population. And it found, in the building's basement, human skeletons. The show depicts this and moves on without explanation. Nobody asks who those people were, how they died, why they are in the basement of a working nuclear facility, or whether the facility's management might bear some responsibility for their presence there. The man whose job it is to prevent all of this is Homer Simpson. Homer is the plant's safety inspector. This is his official title and his official role. He is, by the show's own internal logic and by the explicit statement of its creator, a man with an IQ of approximately 55, not a casual estimate, but a figure stated on the record and consistent with the show's depiction of Homer's cognitive function across its entire run. He is a man who, in a canonical episode, was found to have had a crayon physically lodged in his brain since childhood, mechanically reducing his cognitive capacity in ways that were measurable and significant. He is a man who sleeps at his workstation, who eats during meltdown warnings, who once caused a nuclear incident by throwing a donut into the reactor core to observe whether it would grow larger. This is the person standing between Springfield and catastrophic nuclear failure. He has been standing there for over 3 decades, and the cooling towers have been cracking, and the waste has been flowing, and the luminous rats have been running through the walls, and the chewing gum has been doing the structural work of industrial containment infrastructure. The iceberg traces what this has produced in the population. Start with the fish. The three-eyed fish named Blinky appeared in Season 2 and immediately became one of the show's most enduring images. Blinky is pulled from a river near the plant and held up as evidence by a political candidate that Burns is poisoning the local environment. Burns is forced to eat the fish on live television to demonstrate that it is harmless. The town watches. The political moment passes. Nobody conducts a follow-up study of the river. Nobody asks what else is in it. Nobody asks the question that the three-eyed fish makes obvious. If the radiation has given the fish a third eye, what has it done to the organisms consuming the same water? The iceberg's answer is that it has produced Springfield's residents as they appear in the show. The physical features that distinguish Springfield's population from every outsider who visits, the specific four-fingered anatomy, the overbites, the proportions that don't quite map onto human biological norms, the remarkable resilience to physical trauma that Homer demonstrates across hundreds of episodes. Homer has survived injuries that would be instantly fatal to any real human being. He has fallen off cliffs, been struck by cars, been shot, been electrocuted, been crushed, been set on fire, been subjected to physical forces that exceed anything a biological organism could be expected to survive. He recovers with a speed and completeness that the show presents as comedic exaggeration, and that the iceberg reads as evidence of a biology that has been fundamentally altered by decades of radiation exposure. His cellular repair mechanisms are not normal. His pain tolerance and injury resilience are not normal. They are the product of a body that has been changed at a fundamental level by the environment it has lived in. Burns himself is the most extreme example of this, and his case is worth extended attention. Burns has been established, across multiple episodes and through direct statement from characters within the show, as a man who was born in the late 1800s and has been alive for well over a century. He has memories of historical events from before the turn of the 20th century. He has described personal relationships with historical figures who died before the Second World War. He served in the war in a capacity the show depicts as morally ambiguous at best. He attended Yale, he knew Howard Hughes. His family history, the Burns dynasty that precedes even Charles Montgomery himself, extends back into American history for centuries, a lineage of concentrated wealth and accumulated power that has been operating in continuous, unbroken succession for longer than most American institutions have existed. He should not be alive. By every biological standard, he should not be alive. The show addresses this directly in the Springfield Files episode. Burns undergoes a weekly medical treatment that the show describes as so intensive, so saturated with chemical and radiological intervention, that it produces a visible green luminescence in his body. The treatment keeps him alive for exactly 1 more week. Without it, administered on schedule, he dies. His survival is not a function of natural biology. It is an engineered process, a controlled chemical management of biological systems that have been so fundamentally altered by a century of radiation proximity that they can no longer sustain themselves through any natural process. Burns is not surviving. He is being maintained. The distinction matters because maintenance implies something that can fail. There is a schedule. There is a dependency. There is a man Smithers, always Smithers, who manages that schedule with a vigilance that the show frames as devotion but that the iceberg reads as something closer to medical necessity. Smithers does not attend to Burns out of simple loyalty. He attends to Burns because he understands, probably better than anyone else alive, that Burns's survival is a managed process and that the manager's absence from that process is a death sentence. This is the ecology of the nuclear plant at the iceberg level. Burns has spent a century managing the effects of radiation in his own body, developing the expertise and the infrastructure and the pharmaceutical resources to keep himself operational through what amounts to chronic radiation poisoning of extreme duration. And he is surrounded by a town whose residents have been subjected to the same radiation at lower doses for shorter periods, though the shorter periods are now measured in decades, and who have developed their own biological adaptations to that exposure without resources, without awareness, without anyone to manage the process for them. The yellow skin is one adaptation. The four fingers are another. Homer's resilience is another. Blinky's third eye is another. Springfield's ecology, animal and human, has been modified by the plant in ways that are visible everywhere if you know what you are looking at and are willing to read them as a connected picture, rather than as a series of unrelated cartoon details. The plant is not just the place Homer works. The plant is the condition under which Springfield exists. The cracked cooling towers in the background of the establishing shots are not scenery. They are the show's consistent, persistent, never quite acknowledged reminder of what is happening to the people in the frame. 342 violations, 3 decades. A three-eyed fish and luminous rats and human skeletons in the basement, and a safety inspector who is asleep at his desk. That is what the nuclear plant has done. And the town has never noticed because the plant made sure it wouldn't. Section 4. The economy of Springfield, and why nobody leaves. Nobody in Springfield has enough money, and nobody in Springfield is meaningfully suffering from not having enough money. These two facts coexist in the show with a serenity that the actual math of the situation cannot quite support, and the iceberg finds in that gap one of the show's most consistent and most carefully constructed arguments about American economic life. Homer Simpson earns his living at the nuclear plant. His salary has been estimated, across various episodes where money becomes relevant to the plot, at somewhere in the range of $50,000 annually, though the specificity of this figure shifts depending on what the episode needs it to be. On that salary, he supports a family of 5 in a house on Evergreen Terrace that appears, when the show bothers to assign it a value, to be worth roughly $100,000. The family has a car, sometimes 2. They eat out with a frequency that would be difficult to sustain on a strict budget. Homer maintains what appears to be a daily presence at Moe's Tavern, consuming quantities of Duff beer that, if you actually tried to cost them out against his salary and the family's other expenses, would produce a troubling picture. The children attend public school. The family goes on vacations, sometimes international ones. Maggie has a steady supply of pacifiers. The household functions. The show has never attempted to make Homer's budget add up in any consistent way, because making it add up would require either making Homer significantly poorer than the show depicts him, or making him significantly wealthier than his job would support. Neither of those options serves the comedy, which requires Homer to be approximately at the lower edge of middle-class stability, close enough to comfort that the losses of that comfort can be funny rather than genuinely desperate, far enough from wealth that the precariousness of his position is always present as a background pressure. What makes this economic situation interesting at the iceberg level is not the inconsistency of Homer's budget. It is the structure of the economic system that surrounds him. Springfield is a company town. This is the most precise description of its economic ecology, and understanding what company towns are and how they function explains a significant amount of what otherwise appears to be simply the background furniture of the show. A company town, in American economic history, is a settlement organized around a single employer who controls not just the labor market but a significant portion of the material infrastructure of daily life. In the classic company towns of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the coal towns of Appalachia, the mill towns of the textile-producing South, the mining settlements of the West, this control was explicit and comprehensive. The company owned the houses where workers lived. The company operated the stores where workers shopped, accepting the company's own script currency rather than cash. The company ran the utilities, the church, sometimes the school. Workers were bound to the company not only by their employment but by the fact that everything they needed to sustain their lives outside work also came from the company. Leaving the company town meant leaving behind your house, your credit, your community connections, and often your entire economic identity, because the only skills you had were skills the company had needed, and the only reference you had was the company you were leaving. The structural effect of this arrangement was to make meaningful resistance collective action, demands for better conditions, organization toward improved wages effectively impossible, because the company controlled the conditions under which people could afford to resist. Springfield is not as extreme as the classic company towns. There are businesses in Springfield that Burns does not own directly. Moe's Tavern, the Quick E-Mart, the Springfield Shopper newspaper, Luigi's Restaurant, Android's Dungeon, The First Church of Springfield is presumably not a Burns subsidiary. The town has an economic ecosystem that extends beyond the plant. But the plant is the gravitational center of that ecosystem, in ways that every episode that touches on Springfield's economics confirms. The plant is the town's largest employer and its primary source of electrical power. Burns's personal wealth, influence, and political connections make him the most powerful individual in Springfield by a margin so large that the second most powerful person in town is not really in the same category. When Burns wants something from the municipal government, he gets it. When Burns runs for governor, he comes close enough to winning that the show has to engineer a fairly elaborate plot device to prevent it. When Burns shuts off the power to Springfield in one episode, the town's infrastructure collapses almost immediately, demonstrating that the plant is not just one economic actor among many, but the load-bearing element of the entire structure. Homer's specific position within this structure is worth examining in detail, because it is more complicated than it first appears. Homer is the plant's safety inspector. He has held this position for the entirety of his adult working life. He has held it through hundreds of documented errors, through at least one period of unemployment when the plant was briefly sold to German investors who immediately fired him, through firings and rehirings and near firings, and moments when Burns has forgotten Homer's name and then remembered it and then forgotten it again. The German investor episode is the one the Iceberg community returns to most consistently as evidence that Homer's continued employment is not a consequence of Burns's negligence or forgetfulness. When the German investors take over, their first substantive action is to fire Homer. Their second is to commission an assessment of the plant's compliance requirements. The assessment produces a cost estimate so enormous that it nearly bankrupts the investment group within weeks of the acquisition. Burns repurchases the plant for a fraction of what he sold it for and immediately rehires Homer. The sequence is presented as a comedy of corporate incompetence and Homer's improbable good fortune. The Iceberg reads it as a deliberate demonstration of why Homer exists in the role he occupies. A competent safety inspector would shut the plant down within a matter of weeks. The regulatory violations are so extensive and so severe that any professional with the qualifications the role requires, doing the job the role describes, would have no choice but to initiate the documentation process that leads to plant closure or comprehensive remediation. Either outcome would cost Burns an enormous amount of money and, more significantly, would require him to acknowledge the violations publicly, opening the question of what they had already done. Homer does not do any of this. Homer has never done any of this. Homer's specific combination of low cognitive function, high tolerance for occupational hazard, and complete incuriosity about the systems around him makes him precisely the kind of safety inspector a plant operating at 342 violations needs. He is not a failing safety inspector. He is a perfect one, for Burns's purposes. The gap between what his job title describes and what his presence in that role actually produces is the gap that keeps the plant operational and profitable. Burns knows this. The German investor episode proves he knows it, because his first action after reacquiring the plant is to restore exactly the personnel configuration that keeps the violations safely undocumented. This is a management decision made with full awareness of its operational logic. The deal with Grandpa adds another layer. Later seasons of the show establish that Homer's job security, his remarkable, seemingly inexplicable ability to retain his position through failures that would end any ordinary career, is the product of an agreement made between his grandfather and Burns. Abraham Simpson discovered something about Burns, the exact nature of which the show deliberately keeps vague, and instead of acting on this knowledge in any way that might produce accountability, struck a private deal. His silence in exchange for Homer's guaranteed employment. This arrangement, when you hold it next to everything else the Iceberg has established, forms a picture of considerable darkness. The man who forced Homer's mother out of his life when Homer was a small child is also, through the deal Grandpa made, the guarantor of Homer's economic stability as an adult. The deepest personal loss Homer has ever experienced, and the primary source of his material security are connected to the same person. Homer does not know this. He has never been told. He shows up every morning to the facility owned by the man most responsible for his childhood being what it was, protected by an arrangement that his own father made in secret with that same man and he eats his donut at his desk and falls asleep in his chair, and the cooling towers leak and the fish develop third eyes, and the town doesn't notice because the man who owns the plant also owns the structures within which the town might otherwise have noticed. The reason nobody leaves Springfield is not geography, and it is not sentimentality, and it is not any of the reasons that characters occasionally articulate within episodes. It is the reason that nobody leaves company towns. Because the company is the economy, and the economy is the company, and leaving means stepping outside the only system you have ever been part of, and into an uncertainty that, however irrational this calculus might look from outside, feels more dangerous than staying. Homer's donut is real. The hole in it is also real. And the hole is where everything the arrangement costs him goes, invisible at the center of the thing that is supposed to make the arrangement feel worthwhile. Section 5. The Children Who Never Grow. Bart Simpson has been 10 years old since the 17th of December, 1989, which means he has been 10 years old for longer than most of the people watching this video have been alive. This is a factual statement that is also, when you actually stop and hold it rather than immediately processing it as background information about an animated show, genuinely strange. Think about what it means, not for a production, but for a character. A person who is 10 years old has been 10 years old for 36 years. A person who is 10 years old has lived through enough episodes worth of experience to constitute decades of a real human life. Bart has traveled internationally. He has been briefly famous. He has fallen in love, genuinely and painfully, multiple times. He has been exploited, he has been wrongly accused, he has made genuine friends and lost them. He has had moments of real moral clarity and moments of real moral failure. He has done things that would, in a real life, permanently alter the person doing them, the way that significant experiences permanently alter real people. He is still 10 years old. And every Monday morning, or whatever the in-universe equivalent is, he wakes up in the same bed at 742 Evergreen Terrace with the same skateboard and the same attitude and the same essential relationship to authority, which is one of reflexive resistance executed with considerable talent and essentially no strategy. The experiences do not accumulate. The learning does not persist. The person that a real child would be becoming, given everything Bart has been through, never emerges, because the emergence requires time to pass, and time does not pass for Bart. This is the floating timeline. It is a standard convention of long-running animated television, and in most cases it is simply part of the format's terms and conditions. You accept that the characters do not age because aging would require the show to eventually become a different show about different people, and the audience's relationship is with the current show about the current people. The Simpsons has been using this convention for so long that its consequences have become visible in ways that they are not in shows with shorter runs. A show using a floating timeline for 5 seasons has not accumulated enough to make the non-aging feel strange. A show using it for 36 seasons has. The length of the run transforms the convention from a practical storytelling decision into something that requires its own explanation, and the iceberg offers several. The simplest iceberg explanation is the radiation theory, which the previous section established. The characters do not age because their biology has been altered at the cellular level by chronic radiation exposure, and one of the effects of that alteration is an arrest in normal biological aging processes. This is consistent with several things the show has established about Springfield's population, including Burns's extraordinary lifespan and Homer's extraordinary resilience to physical trauma. If radiation can keep a man alive for a century through managed biological maintenance, it is not a large conceptual step to suggest that at lower doses, it might simply slow or arrest the biological clock for less wealthy recipients. The other major iceberg explanation for the frozen timeline is the coma theory, which deserves its own section and will receive one shortly. The short version is that Homer has been in a coma since 1993, and every episode since then is a dream generated by his unconscious mind, which naturally cannot age the people in it because it has no reference material for what they look like older than they were when Homer lost consciousness. But before we get to the coma, it is worth staying with what the frozen children mean as characters within the show's emotional architecture, independent of whatever external explanation you prefer for why they don't age. Bart, at the age of 10, is rebellion, pure, developmental, instinct-level rebellion against authority, against the institutional expectations of childhood, against the adults who have arranged the world to serve their purposes and handed children a set of scripts they are expected to perform within. At 10, this rebellion is age-appropriate and emotionally honest. It is the kind of rebellion that, in real development, gradually becomes something more considered. The 10-year-old who resists authority impulsively grows into the adolescent who begins to distinguish between authority worth resisting and authority that exists for legitimate reasons, and then into the young adult who has a theory about when and how resistance is warranted, and eventually into the adult who either acts from that theory or has found a way to accommodate the world that does not require constant performance of resistance. Bart cannot do any of this because Bart cannot age through the developmental stages that would produce it. His rebellion remains at the instinctual stage. It never develops into a philosophy. It never makes choices about what is worth fighting for. It remains perpetually at the 10-year-old level, which means it remains perpetually reflexive rather than considered, perpetually reactive rather than strategic. This has produced, over the show's later seasons, a Bart whose comedy feels more mechanical than it once did. The early seasons could reach into Bart's rebellion and find the specific emotional truth underneath it, the gap between his performed indifference and his actual sensitivity, between the mischief and the fear that motivates it. The later seasons run the rebellion as a genre convention, a format requirement, because the character's development has been arrested at the stage where the rebellion is all there is to work with. Lisa's case is different, and, the Iceberg argues, more genuinely poignant. Lisa is 8 years old. She has been 8 years old since 1989. She is the show's conscience, its moral center, its most consistent argument that the world could be better than it is if anyone were paying adequate attention to what is wrong with it. She notices injustice. She articulates it clearly. She argues for correctives with the full intensity of an 8-year-old who has not yet learned that correct arguments lose to entrenched interest the majority of the time. At 8 years old, you can believe that being right is sufficient. You can believe that the argument, made clearly and forcefully enough, will eventually produce the change it is calling for. The specific exhaustion of being right about things that don't change the knowledge that correctness is not the same as leverage, that insight is not the same as power, that caring more than the people around you does not actually produce the outcome that caring should produce. This is something that comes later. Real development brings it. Real experience with how the world responds to the kind of intelligence and commitment Lisa represents produces a more complicated person on the other side. Lisa cannot become that more complicated person because she cannot age through the process that would produce her. She is frozen at 8, at the age of maximum idealism and minimum cynicism, and the show runs her character through the same fundamental arc over and over. She sees something wrong, she argues for the right thing, she is dismissed or temporarily validated, and then the validation evaporates, and next week she sees something wrong again with exactly the same intensity she brought to it the week before. What the Iceberg notices about Lisa's freezing is that it is the cruelest of the 3 children's frozen states, because Lisa is the one whose character most requires development to complete itself. Bart's rebellion is readable and meaningful at 10. Maggie's watchfulness is readable and meaningful at 1. But Lisa's particular combination of intelligence and moral commitment exists at 8 in a state that is explicitly preliminary. The Lisa at 8 is becoming something. The flash-forward episodes where the show imagines adult Lisa confirm this. She becomes a fully realized person who has integrated her gifts with her experiences into a more complex and more specifically positioned self. The show gives you that version of Lisa in glimpses, in single episodes, and then puts her away and returns the 8-year-old to her saxophone. Each time it does this, it is acknowledging the cost of the floating timeline while declining to pay it. The cost is the full version of Lisa. What the show keeps instead is the preliminary version, useful for specific storytelling purposes, frozen at the age where her particular gifts are most legible, as comedy and as moral argument, without requiring the show to grapple with what those gifts actually need to become what they could be. Maggie is a different case from both Bart and Lisa, and her difference is the most interesting of the 3. Maggie has been 1 year old for 36 years. She cannot walk without falling. She communicates primarily through pacifier sounds. She has, in the show's canonical history, spoken one word. She is, in every external indicator, an infant, and the show's comedy has consistently deployed her as an infant prop. The baby in the high chair, the baby in the car seat, the baby being carried and held and fed. But the show has also, across dozens of episodes that center on Maggie or include her as more than a background presence, established that what is happening inside Maggie is significantly more complex than what her external presentation suggests. In the theatrical short The Longest Daycare, which was nominated for an Academy Award, Maggie is deposited at a daycare and proceeds, over the course of 7 minutes, to execute a rescue operation for a caterpillar that requires her to read her environment, identify threats, develop a multi-step plan, adapt that plan in real time when it encounters obstacles, and execute it with timing and precision that no actual one-year-old possesses. She does this without speaking, without the ability to reliably walk. Using only the cognitive resources available to her and the problem-solving capacity that those resources, in her specific case, are considerably greater than her developmental stage should permit. The show has tested Maggie's intelligence on multiple occasions and produced results that the episodes treat as gags off-the-chart scores, results that exceed the measurement capacity of the instruments being used, and then move on without following the implications. The gag is the punchline. The implication is the iceberg material. If Maggie's cognitive capacity is genuinely extraordinary, if she has been operating at a level far beyond what any one-year-old should be capable of for 36 years, then the question of why she has maintained the presentation of a one-year-old for 36 years is not a continuity question. It is a character question. And the answer the iceberg arrives at, by looking at what Maggie has watched from her high chair across the show's entire run, is strategy. Lisa uses her intelligence visibly. She announces it. She argues from it. She wears it on the outside where everyone can see it, and the show has spent 36 seasons documenting what happens to visible intelligence in Springfield. It earns its owner isolation, mockery, a series of partial victories that resolve into nothing, and a sustained friction with the community around her that makes her the most specifically lonely person in her own family. Maggie has watched all of this. She has watched her sister fight for recognition from a community constitutionally unwilling to provide it, using tools that the community finds threatening rather than useful. And from the high chair with those enormous patient eyes, she has drawn a different conclusion about how intelligence ought to be deployed in an environment like Springfield's. You do not announce it. You do not argue from it. You do not make yourself legible as the smartest person in the room, because the smartest person in the room in Springfield gets treated the way Lisa gets treated. You watch, you wait, you maintain the most complete possible disguise in Maggie's case. The disguise of an infant, which is the social position that receives the least scrutiny and the least threat and the most freedom of movement precisely because nobody is watching closely enough to see what is actually happening behind the pacifier. This is the iceberg reading of Maggie's silence. Not developmental delay, not a character the show has simply not gotten around to developing. A strategic choice made by a consciousness sophisticated enough to recognize that invisibility, in Springfield, is the most powerful position available. What Maggie is waiting to do is the show's deepest unresolved mystery. She has been waiting since 1989. She has accumulated 36 years of watching. She knows Springfield better than any other character because no other character has spent 3 decades in the one position that allows you to observe everything without being observed in return. And she has not yet decided that the moment is right. When she does decide, the iceberg suggests Springfield will not see it coming. That is the design. That is the whole point of the waiting. Section 6. The Coma Theory. On the 1st of April 1993, the 18th episode of Season 4 of The Simpsons aired on Fox. Its title was So It's Come to This, a Simpsons clip show, and its premise was exactly what the title suggests. Bart plays a series of progressively escalating April Fool's pranks on Homer, culminating in a particularly dramatic one. Bart takes one of Homer's beer cans to an auto body shop and places it in an industrial paint shaker. When Homer opens the can, the resulting explosion is violent enough to put him in the hospital. So far, this is standard Simpsons. Homer is in the hospital. The family is worried. There is probably some comedy about Homer's medical situation. This is territory the show has visited before and will visit again. But then Homer, lying in his hospital bed recovering from the explosion, reaches for a candy bar from the vending machine across the room. The machine tips over. It lands on Homer, and Homer Simpson enters a clinical coma. This is depicted as a real event within the episode, not a cutaway gag, not a dream sequence. Homer is genuinely medically unconscious. The family gathers. Bart sits at his bedside crying, confessing through tears that the entire chain of events was his fault, that he is responsible for whatever happens to his father. And in the episode's resolution, Homer springs awake, immediately begins strangling Bart, and everyone laughs. And the show presents this as the end of the story. Except it includes one more piece of information, offered almost as an afterthought. During the coma, Homer lost 5% of his brain function. The coma destroyed a measurable, permanent portion of his cognitive capacity. 5% of Homer's brain is gone, damaged beyond recovery. And Homer's response to learning this is to laugh, while simultaneously noting that he does not understand why he is laughing. The episode ends, the show continues. The Homer coma theory, which has been the single most popular and most extensively documented fan theory in the Simpsons Iceberg for decades, begins here. Its core claim is this: Homer Simpson did not actually wake up from that coma. The recovery depicted at the end of the episode is not real. Everything that has aired since the 1st of April 1993, every single episode across 30-plus additional seasons, every storyline, every character development, every guest appearance, every impossible event, every increasingly surreal plot is a dream being generated by the unconscious mind of a man lying in a hospital bed in Springfield General, slowly losing brain function while his family sits beside him and waits for him to open his eyes. The evidence assembled in support of this theory is, in its totality, more compelling than a brief summary can fully convey. Let us go through it carefully. The first and most often cited piece of evidence is the tonal shift. Before the coma episode, The Simpsons was a show with a specific register, grounded in recognizable human experience, rooted in the everyday pressures of working-class family life, using exaggeration as a tool of satire but maintaining a connection to the kind of situations real people actually find themselves in. Homer tries to quit drinking. Marge and Homer navigate genuine marital tension. Bart faces real consequences for his academic failure. Lisa develops a genuine, specifically depicted crush on a substitute teacher. These are human stories told through a satirical lens, but they are tethered to the human. After the coma episode, the show's register shifts dramatically. Homer goes to space. Burns captures the Loch Ness Monster. Homer discovers that his mother is a political fugitive. Homer joins a secret society. Homer meets God. Homer holds several hundred different jobs across subsequent seasons. Homer travels internationally with a frequency and ease that bears no relationship to his stated income. The escalation of absurdity is not gradual. It is, in retrospect, rather sudden. The show before the coma and the show after the coma are different shows, and the coma is the dividing line. The coma theory's explanation for this is precise. Before April 1993, you are watching Homer's actual life. After April 1993, you are watching Homer's unconscious mind trying to sustain a version of his life that grows increasingly distorted as his brain function continues to deteriorate from the coma's damage. The aging problem is the second major piece of evidence, and it is the one the theory explains most elegantly. Nobody in Springfield ages. This fact, which we have already examined in the section on the frozen children, requires some explanation. The radiation theory offers biological alteration. The floating timeline explanation offers production convention. The coma theory offers something simpler and more emotionally complete. Nobody ages because they exist inside the memory and imagination of a man who lost consciousness in 1993 and has no reference material for what they look like older than they were on that day. Homer's children are frozen at their 1,993 ages because Homer's unconscious mind cannot imagine them growing up. It has no data for what a grown-up Bart or Lisa or Maggie would look like because Homer was not there to see it happen. His brain generates them as he last knew them, repeating and repeating the same people in the same bodies across what must be, in real time, decades of unconscious experience. Marge is the Marge of 1,993 because that is the Marge that Homer's unconscious mind can hold. The town is the town of 1993, updated in surface detail but fundamentally preserved, because a dreaming brain uses what it has. The celebrity cameos are the third piece of evidence, and they explain something that the regular continuity explanation Springfield has become a magnet for famous people handles less convincingly. In the earlier seasons, celebrity appearances are relatively rare and tend to be either organic to the plot or deliberately absurdist. After the coma, they multiply. Famous musicians, athletes, actors, politicians, public figures of every description begin appearing in Springfield at a rate that has no realistic explanation within the show's universe. The coma theory's explanation is that Homer's brain, unconscious and lying in a hospital room with a television presumably somewhere in the background, is receiving ambient input from the outside world. Sounds from the TV, voices from conversations happening near his bed, music from radios, snippets of news. His unconscious mind processes this ambient input and incorporates it into the dream. Every celebrity who appears in Springfield is a name or voice that Homer's comatose brain registered through the background noise of the hospital environment, translated by the dream into a guest appearance. Springfield is not actually attracting famous people. Homer's brain is absorbing famous people from the media environment surrounding his hospital bed and weaving them into the story it is telling itself. The fourth piece of evidence is theological, and it is the one that the Iceberg community finds most striking for the specificity of its timing. In the Season 4 episode Homer the Heretic, which aired 6 months before the coma episode, Homer has a direct conversation with God. God appears to Homer in a dream, they talk, and during the conversation, God tells Homer something significant, that Homer will learn the meaning of life. But not yet. God says Homer's time is coming. Homer's time. 6 months later, Homer is in a coma. Within the internal logic of the show's universe, where God is a confirmed, speaking character with genuine knowledge of future events, this reads as a prophecy. God told Homer that his time was approaching. 6 months later, Homer lost consciousness. The coma theory reads this as the show embedding, 6 months in advance, the theological framing for what was about to happen. God was not saying Homer would soon achieve some form of enlightenment. God was saying Homer's time as a conscious, present participant in his own life was nearly up, and 6 months later, it ended. The show itself has engaged with the coma theory on multiple occasions. In Season 34, the production team created what appeared to be a deleted scene in which Homer wakes from a long coma, and the show reveals that all the outlandish episodes were dreams. This scene was released as a tease, and then explained as a fake, a hoax planted by fictional hackers, not a genuine revelation. The show laughed it off, but the Iceberg community noted that the production team animated it, voiced it, and released it in a form indistinguishable from actual show content, which suggests a rather more serious ongoing engagement with the theory than a simple dismissal would require. You do not create a fake confirmation of a fan theory that you genuinely find unimportant. Al Jean, the show's long-running executive producer, addressed the theory directly in 2015 and dismissed it. He said it was not true. The Iceberg community received this statement with the awareness that a producer saying a theory is not true is not the same as the theory being wrong. What Al Jean could not explain, and did not explain, was why the tonal shift happened precisely when it happened, why nobody ages, why the show grows more surreal with each passing decade, in exactly the pattern you would expect from a dreaming brain running out of cognitive resources to maintain its simulation. Whether you accept the coma theory or not is less important than what the theory does. It makes the show make sense. All of it. The floating timeline, the absurdist escalation, the celebrity flood, the reset between episodes that erases all consequences, Homer's physical invulnerability. It provides a frame within which the entire post-1993 show is internally coherent in a way that no other single explanation manages. And it reframes the emotional character of the show in a way that the Iceberg finds genuinely moving. If the coma theory is true, then The Simpsons is not a comedy. Or rather, it is a comedy that is also a tragedy. The thing that Homer's unconscious mind keeps producing, across season after season of increasingly improbable adventures, is the same family, at the same ages, in the same house. No matter how far the dream takes Homer to space, to Japan, to the bottom of the ocean, To encounters with God and celebrities and monsters, he always ends up back on the couch at 742 Evergreen Terrace. The family is always there. Marge still loves him. Bart is still 10. Lisa is still 8. Maggie is still reaching up her arms to be held. Homer's deepest, most desperate wish, encoded in every episode of the Post-Coma show, whether or not you read it through the theory's lens, is simple enough to break your heart. He wants his family. He wants them to be okay. He wants to be home. And in the coma, the dream gives him that. Over and over and over. The family preserved in the amber of 1993. The house always there at the end of the episode. Evergreen Terrace always exactly as he left it. The coma is not a nightmare. The coma, read through this theory, is the only heaven a man like Homer Simpson would ever ask for. Friday night at the house, the beer cold, the family together. Nobody has to grow up. Nobody has to leave. The credits roll. The family laughs. The dream resets for next week. Section 7, the secondary cast and what they hide. Springfield has a population that the show has estimated at various points between 30,000 and several 100,000, depending on what the plot requires. This inconsistency is itself iceberg material, but we will address geography and consistency separately. For now, the point is that Springfield contains enough people to support a secondary and tertiary cast of recurring characters so deep and so specifically drawn that several of them have accumulated enough canonical detail to anchor entire seasons. Of episodes on their own, the secondary cast lives at a slight remove from the show's central reset mechanism. The Simpson family's emotional state clears between episodes by narrative necessity. Secondary characters, less central to the show's core structure, occasionally accumulate in ways that produce depth the show did not entirely plan for or planned for, and then could not find the time or willingness to fully develop. Barney Gumble is the clearest example of buried potential in the secondary cast, and his story is one of the specific ones the iceberg returns to as evidence of what Springfield does to people. Before the timeline of the show's present, Barney was Homer's closest friend and, in flashback episodes, a person with genuine trajectory, academic capability, social confidence, something that looked like a future. The flashback episodes depict young Barney with the specificity of a person who was going somewhere before the thing that stopped him happened. And the thing that stopped him was a single beer offered by Homer at a party that turned out to be the first beer Barney had ever drunk. The show stages this moment with its characteristic blend of comedy and genuine melancholy. One beer at one party, and then Barney Gumble, who had been heading somewhere, spent the next several decades at the bar stool at Moe's, present at every episode in a peripheral role, deployed as a background fixture, funny in the reflexive, uncomplicated way of characters the show has decided not to look at closely. The sobriety episode interrupts this with sudden, specific force. Barney enters recovery. He stops drinking, and the person underneath the alcoholism, when the drinking is removed, turns out to be someone thoughtful and articulate and genuinely interested in the world. Sober Barney has things to say that are worth hearing. He makes decisions that demonstrate real self-awareness. He is the kind of person you would want to know. And then he relapses, and the show returns him to his stool, and the background comedy resumes. What the episode leaves behind is the knowledge that the comedy was always at the expense of a real person. That the drunk at the bar stool was someone before the drinking and is still someone underneath it, and that person has been functionally absent from Springfield's social life since he was a teenager because of a beer that Homer handed him at a party that Homer has presumably never thought about in relation to Barney's condition for a single moment in the decades since. The iceberg holds Barney as Springfield's most explicit statement about the relationship between individual choices and systemic context. He did not choose to be an alcoholic in the sense that implies a fully informed agent selecting a course of action from a range of available alternatives. He was a person with a specific vulnerability who encountered that vulnerability in an environment with no resources for managing it, no support structures for recovery, and a primary social institution, Moe's Tavern, specifically organized around the consumption of alcohol. The choice was one choice, and the system around the choice made the consequences inevitable. Ned Flanders is the secondary character who the iceberg examines with the most sustained attention, because Ned's story is the one that most directly illuminates what Springfield does to goodness. On the surface, Ned is everything Homer is not. Kind where Homer is selfish, generous where Homer is acquisitive, devout where Homer is irreverent, physically fit where Homer is decidedly not, financially responsible where Homer is chaotic, a good father, a good neighbor, a man who tries to live according to a moral framework and who demonstrates consistently what it looks like to actually try. The show punishes him for this, not in the comic sense of a well-meaning character encountering funny obstacles. In a deeper, more specifically structured sense, Springfield's universe consistently, comprehensively, fails to reward Ned Flanders for anything he does right. His wife Maude was killed in a freak accident at the Springfield Speedway. A t-shirt cannon misfired during an event because Homer was dodging the t-shirts and they struck Maude instead. Homer's specific selfishness in that moment, his reflexive avoidance of inconvenience with no thought for its consequences, directly killed the woman Ned loved. And Ned forgave him. Because Ned always forgives. Because Ned's fundamental character trait, the niceness and the patience and the grace, does not permit him to do otherwise. Later episodes reveal the architecture of this forgiveness, and it changes what it means entirely. Ned was a violent child, uncontrollable. His beatnik parents, philosophically opposed to discipline of any kind, took him to a psychiatrist who subjected young Ned to an extended program of behavioral modification. The specifics are treated as comedy in the episode's framing, but the content is real. A child's natural emotional responses, including anger, including the capacity for self-assertion, including the ability to be appropriately outraged by things that warrant outrage, were systematically suppressed through a process he was too young to consent to or resist. What was left, after the conditioning, was Ned. The niceness is not natural character. The patience is not spiritual achievement. The grace extended to Homer after Maude's death is not a product of Ned's faith producing genuine forgiveness. It is the learned response of a man whose behavioral programming requires him to suppress anger at all costs, because the alternative the person Ned would be if the conditioning failed is the person who emerged briefly when Ned's house was destroyed and the community's inadequate rebuilding effort caused it to collapse. A man screaming at everyone who had ever wronged him, releasing decades of compressed rage in a public breakdown that got him institutionalized. That is what lives underneath Ned's niceness. That is what the conditioning is containing. And knowing this, watching Ned extend grace to Homer across 36 seasons of Homer doing things that warrant anger is watching a man whose capacity for appropriate response was taken from him before he was old enough to know he had it. The show also establishes that God confirmed as a real and active presence in Springfield's universe, confirmed as a character who speaks directly to Homer Simpson on multiple occasions, does not speak to Ned Flanders. God talks to Homer. Homer, who falls asleep in church, who skips services, whose engagement with organized religion is sporadic and largely instrumental, has had direct divine conversations confirmed by multiple canonical episodes. God appears to Homer in dreams. God gives Homer information about future events. God, within the show's internal logic, finds Homer's company interesting or useful, or at least worth the engagement. Ned has been in church every Sunday for decades. He has prayed. He has tried. He has organized his entire life around his faith in a divine presence that his faith assures him is listening. And the show has never given him a single canonical moment of direct divine communication, comparable to what Homer receives with such regularity that it barely registers as unusual. The Iceberg reads this pattern as the show's theological argument, embedded in the structure of who the divine engages with rather than stated directly. God, in Springfield's universe, appears to find the structured performance of faith less interesting than the raw, unmediated engagement of someone who has no performance to maintain. Homer encounters God through the gaps in his consciousness, the places where there is simply not enough happening to fill the space, the moments of genuine emptiness that his limitations produce. Ned's consciousness is full of framework, full of the organized practice of devotion, full of the very structures that, paradoxically, may be preventing the contact that the structures are intended to facilitate. This is a strange place to find that specific mystical argument, but it is there, in the 36-year pattern of divine attention, and the Iceberg has been documenting it. Sideshow Bob is the secondary character who has generated the most elaborate iceberg analysis, And he deserves careful attention because he is the show's only recurring antagonist who makes arguments rather than simply causing trouble. Robert Underdunk Terwilliger Jr. was Krusty the Clown's sidekick, a classically trained actor and musician occupying a position that required him to be struck in the face with rakes for the amusement of children. He framed Krusty, took over the show, and would have succeeded except that Bart Simpson noticed a detail about Krusty's alleged literacy that Bob's presence in the role made implausible. Bob went to prison, and a vendetta was born that has produced some of the show's most elaborately constructed and most beloved episodes across 7 separate appearances. What distinguishes Bob from the show's other antagonists is that his critique is coherent and not wrong. His contempt for the intellectual vacancy of Krusty's programming, for the way mass entertainment has crowded genuine culture out of the public consciousness, for the specific degradation of being a classically trained artist in an environment that has no use for classical training. None of these are positions the show is endorsing, given that Bob executes them while trying to kill a child. But they are positions the show takes seriously enough to articulate with precision, through a character whose intelligence is established as genuine and whose grievances are drawn from real sources. Bob is Springfield's shadow intellectual. He is what happens when genuine cultivation encounters an environment constitutionally hostile to it. His villainy is not separate from this condition. It is the form the frustration takes when every legitimate outlet has been closed. And the fact that he keeps being defeated by Bart Simpson, the show's avatar of anti-intellectual charm and reflexive non-engagement, is the show's ongoing joke at the expense of its own intellectual pretensions, a joke that acknowledges, with some self-awareness, that cleverness without credentials tends to get the better of training with credentials when they meet in a schoolyard. Section 8. Mona Simpson and the Architecture of Homer's Pain. For the first 6 seasons of The Simpsons, Homer's mother was dead. This was part of the show's foundational backstory, established early and reinforced throughout the early seasons through the specific ways Homer's behavior encoded his relationship to maternal loss. You can see it if you watch the early episodes with this in mind. Homer's desperate need for approval from the people around him, from Burns, from Marge, from his neighbors, from strangers, has a specific quality that is different from simple neediness. It is the quality of need in a person who learned very early that love is contingent and temporary, that the people you depend on can disappear, and who has organized their entire emotional life around minimizing the conditions under which that disappearance might occur. Homer clings, he seeks reassurance. He interprets neutral interactions as rejection and unexpected positive attention as extraordinary gift. He does not believe at a baseline level that he is worth staying for. This is the emotional architecture of a person who lost a mother. The show built it carefully and consistently across its early seasons, using it as the structural foundation of Homer's comedy and of his occasional, genuinely moving moments of genuine emotional vulnerability. And then in Season 7, in the episode Mother Simpson, the show revealed that Homer's mother was alive. She had always been alive. The death was a lie, constructed by Abraham Simpson and maintained across Homer's entire life, concealing a truth that Abraham had decided Homer was better off not knowing. The truth was this: Mona Simpson, Homer's mother, had been a political activist in 1969. She had been a housewife in Springfield when the counterculture reached her in the form of a group of activists targeting what they had identified as a morally unacceptable enterprise in their community. The enterprise was a biological weapons laboratory. It was located in Springfield. It was owned by Charles Montgomery Burns. Burns, who already owned the nuclear power plant and who would later be established as Springfield's primary economic power, was also, in 1969, manufacturing weapons-grade biological agents in a facility within the same community where families were raising children and where Homer Simpson was growing up. The activists, Mona among them, broke into the facility and destroyed the biological material stored inside. The action was successful. They were leaving when Mona stopped to help someone who had fallen in the chaos. That person was Burns. She helped him up. He saw her face. He reported her to the FBI, and Mona Simpson became a fugitive. She kissed Homer goodnight while he was sleeping, touched his face, and disappeared. She did not come back. Homer woke up and his mother was gone, and Abe told him she had died, and Homer spent the next 2 decades believing he was a boy whose mother had died when he was small, and whose father was too cold and distant to fill the hole she left. The reunion scene between Homer and Mona, when it happens in Mother Simpson, is one of the show's most genuinely emotional sequences. A grown man and his mother separated for 27 years, finding each other beside a gravestone that belongs to neither of them. The comedy drops away entirely. What the scene contains is simply two people and the weight of what was between them and then was not, and now, improbably, is again. And then Burns spots Mona through a cab window and calls the FBI, and the agents arrive and Mona has to run again, and Homer stands in the driveway watching the car carry her away, and the episode ends on Homer sitting on the roof of his car under the stars, alone, in an image of quiet devastation that the show does not undercut with a joke. The Iceberg holds this episode as the most explicit convergence of the show's separate threads: the nuclear plant, Burns's power, Homer's psychology, and the hidden architecture of how all three connect. Burns drove Mona underground. Burns employs Homer. Homer's job security is guaranteed by a deal Burns made with Homer's grandfather. Homer works every day for the man who stole his mother, does not know it, and the systems around him have been arranged to ensure he never finds out. But here's the dimension the Iceberg finds most specific. What Burns took from Homer when Mona left was not just a mother. He took Homer's potential. The crayon episode, which occurs later in the show's run, establishes that Homer's low intelligence is at least partly a mechanical problem. A crayon has been lodged in his brain since childhood, physically reducing his cognitive function. When the crayon is removed, Homer's IQ rises dramatically, and he becomes, briefly, a person capable of genuine intellectual engagement with the world. He is eloquent. He is perceptive. He is the kind of person who looks at his own life and understands it clearly for perhaps the first time. He has the crayon reinserted because being smart in Springfield was unbearable. Because seeing clearly what Springfield is and what his life within it consists of produced a quality of consciousness that was, for Homer, worse than the fog. The crayon is the show's most compressed symbol for what has been done to Homer. But the Iceberg asks the question the episode raises and does not answer. How does a crayon get lodged in a child's brain without anyone noticing? Homer was a child in Springfield when this happened. He had a mother, briefly. He had a father. He presumably had access to the Springfield medical system, and yet the foreign object in his skull went undetected across decades of medical encounters. The Iceberg's answer is that it did not go undetected. It went unaddressed. And the reason it went unaddressed is the same reason 342 nuclear safety violations went unaddressed. Because the person with the motivation and the resources to address them concluded that his interests were better served by leaving them in place. A smart Homer is a Homer who might connect the dots. Might notice that his employer is the same man who destroyed his family. Might understand the deal Grandpa made. Might recognize the architecture of his own situation clearly enough to do something about it. A Homer with a crayon in his brain cannot do any of these things, because the crayon prevents exactly the kind of sustained analytical thinking that connecting those dots requires. Who benefits from the crayon staying in place? Who in Springfield has both the motive to want Homer cognitively impaired and the reach into the town's institutional infrastructure to ensure that no Springfield doctor ever makes a finding that would result in the crayon's removal? The show does not say this directly. The episode about the crayon treats the discovery as an accident of Homer's own investigation, not as the uncovering of a deliberate conspiracy. But the question is there, in the Iceberg, alongside everything else the show has established about how Burns manages the conditions of Springfield's life to serve his own purposes. Burns broke Homer as a child by destroying the family that might have protected him, and the broken Homer has spent his entire adult life in Burns's employ, doing the specific job that the broken Homer is precisely qualified for, maintained in his brokenness by a medical infrastructure that has declined across decades to fix the most obvious fixable cause of his limitation. This is the architecture of Homer's pain. It was built before Homer was old enough to know it was being built. And it is so complete, so comprehensive, so thoroughly embedded in every aspect of his daily life that Homer has no angle from which to see the whole of it. He is inside it. The structure is his Springfield. The walls are his job and his house and his neighbors and the town he has always lived in. He cannot step outside it to see the shape because the shape is everything he knows. Mona knew. That is why she fought. That is why she ended up underground. The one person who saw the whole of it clearly enough to resist it spent 27 years in hiding for the trouble, and when she came back, Burns made sure she ran again. The last time Mona left, Homer was asleep and did not know she was going. The second time, he stood in the driveway and watched it happen and understood, for the first time, why. The show does not give him anything to do with that understanding. He goes back inside. Next week, the couch gag plays, the family assembles, and Homer is at the plant. The architecture persists. The job continues. The cooling towers leak. That is the most honest thing the show ever told about Homer, and it told it in the episode his mother came back. The architecture of his pain was built by the man who signs his paycheck, and he does not have the tools to dismantle it, and the system has arranged things to make sure he never acquires them. Section 9. The Golden Age, The Shift, and What Was Lost. The Simpsons has a golden age. Every serious conversation about the show arrives at this conclusion eventually, and the only debates are about where exactly the golden age begins and where it ends, and what caused the transition from it to the period that followed. The consensus imperfect, disputed at the margins, but real places the peak creative period somewhere between Season 3 and Season 8, with the most concentrated excellence found in Seasons 4, 5, and 6. Within this window, the show produced some of the most precisely crafted television comedy in the history of the medium. The density of good material per episode is extraordinary. The jokes work on multiple levels simultaneously. The emotional beats are credible within the satire rather than disrupting it. The characters behave like specific people rather than like genre types performing their assigned functions. If you want to understand what the Golden Age felt like, watch Last Exit to Springfield. It is widely regarded as one of the finest individual episodes the show has produced, possibly the finest, and it displays every quality that made the Golden Age distinctive. Homer accidentally becomes a union leader. He negotiates with Burns. He does not know what he is doing but stumbles through the negotiation in ways that, through sheer force of incompetence arranged in exactly the right sequence, produce a successful outcome. The episode is dense with jokes that reference, simultaneously, specific Union history, classic film, and the particular comedy of Homer's limitations. The emotional stakes are real within the comedy. The satire is specific enough to have teeth, and the whole thing is constructed with an architectural care that rewards repeated viewing. Now watch a Season 20 episode. The difference is not subtle. It is tonal, structural, and fundamental. The jokes are present. The voice cast is the same. The characters are the same characters, in the same town, in the same house. But something essential is different, and the challenge of articulating what that something is has generated more analysis in the Iceberg community than almost any other question about the show. The most commonly cited explanation for the shift is the writer room. The show's creative leadership changed multiple times across its run, and the different eras correspond with reasonable accuracy to different showrunners and different concentrations of specific writing talent. John Swartzwelder, who wrote 59 episodes of The Simpsons, is the writer whose departure in 2003 the Iceberg community most consistently identifies as a significant loss. His sensibility rigorous within its own absurdism, logically consistent regardless of how illogical the premise, specific to the point where you can identify his episodes by their particular rhythm, was a major component of what made the Golden Age feel the way it did. But showrunner changes don't fully explain what happened, because shows change creative leadership all the time without changing in the fundamental way The Simpsons changed. Something else was operating simultaneously. The cultural saturation theory is more interesting and ultimately more precise. The Simpsons did not just become popular. It became the vocabulary through which a significant portion of the English-speaking world processed American cultural experience. Phrases from the show entered common usage. The specific register of Simpsons humor, the layered joke, the callback, the precise, absurdist timing was absorbed into the DNA of comedy that followed it in ways that made it the background against which subsequent comedy was measured. The problem this creates for the show is that you cannot surprise an audience that has internalized your vocabulary. Comedy depends on surprise in a specific way. The punchline lands because it was not quite the one you anticipated. When the audience has spent 20 years absorbing the show's specific grammar of surprise, the punchlines start to arrive before they should. Not because the writing has gotten worse, but because the audience has gotten better at reading it. This is a peculiar form of success, becoming so influential that you can no longer surprise the audience your influence produced. The Simpsons is, in some measurable sense, too good at being The Simpsons for The Simpsons to achieve the effect it achieved when it was first being The Simpsons. The character inflation theory is the iceberg's most specific explanation, and it points at something real about what changed in the writing. In the Golden Age, the characters were exaggerated people. Homer was not smart, but he was a specific kind of not smart that was rooted in a recognizable human type, the man whose intelligence exists in narrow bands and is genuinely absent in others, who loves his family with an intensity that exceeds his capacity to express that love properly, who stumbles into situations with the confidence of someone who does not know enough to be afraid. The stupidity was one dimension of a portrait. In the later seasons, the stupidity became the portrait. Homer's limitations, which originally existed alongside other characteristics, crowded everything else out. The space that had been occupied by Homer's genuine love for his family, his occasional moments of real wisdom, his capacity for the kind of insight that arrives through emotion rather than intellect, these contracted as the stupidity expanded. Homer became a vehicle for stupidity jokes rather than a person who happened to be limited in specific ways. The same inflation happened across the cast. Ned became more purely nice. Wiggum became more purely incompetent. Burns became more purely villainous. The characters became their own caricatures, which is both literally what happened to a cast of animated characters and figuratively what happens when the shorthand for a character starts to replace the character itself. What was lost in this process is the thing the iceberg calls specificity, and it is important to be precise about what that word means in this context. Specificity does not mean realism. The Simpsons was never realistic. Specificity means that the details of the show, the particular choices made about who these people are and how they behave and what their world looks like, arose from a genuine, considered understanding of the characters and situations being depicted, rather than from the execution of a template. The Golden Age was specific. The specificity showed in every episode. The jokes worked because they were the jokes that these particular characters in this particular situation would produce, not because they were the jokes that a Homer-type character in a generic version of this situation would produce. The distinction sounds subtle, and it is not. It is the difference between watching something true and watching something approximate. The later seasons are approximate. They are competent approximations, frequently funny, sometimes genuinely excellent in individual moments. But the consistent specificity of the Golden Age, the sense that every choice made in the writing room was made by people who understood exactly who they were writing, is less consistently present. The date that the iceberg community most often identifies as the visible marker of the shift is the Season 9 premiere, The Principal and the Pauper, in which Principal Skinner is revealed to be an imposter. His real name is Armin Tamzarian. He is not who he has presented himself as for 20 years. Springfield learns this, holds a town meeting, and votes unanimously to continue treating the imposter as the real Skinner, legally decreeing that he is Skinner and banishing the actual Seymour Skinner from the community under penalty of torture for returning. The episode has been controversial since it aired. Harry Shearer, who voices both Skinner and Burns, publicly stated his displeasure. Critics have called it the moment the show stopped taking its own history seriously. It is consistently ranked among the most disliked episodes in the series. The Iceberg, however, finds this episode more interesting than its reputation suggests. Not because the episode is good, its execution is genuinely problematic in ways that the critical consensus has accurately identified, but because of what it reveals about Springfield when you step back from the specific story and look at the action the town takes. Springfield, when confronted with the truth, votes to outlaw it. The community collectively decides that the reality they are comfortable with is more important than the reality that is actually true, and they formalize this decision through legal decree and enforce it through the threat of violence against anyone who contradicts it. This is, the Iceberg argues, the show finally saying out loud something it had been depicting all along. Springfield has always operated this way. The three-eyed fish appears and the town shrugs. The nuclear plant accumulates violations and nobody acts. Homer survives injuries that should kill him and nobody asks why. The fish glow and the hair spikes maintain their shape without product, and children are born with 4 fingers and yellow skin, and nobody in Springfield stops and demands an explanation for any of it. They do not demand explanations because they have, collectively and implicitly, agreed not to. The Tamzarian episode is the one time the show showed you the mechanism of this agreement in explicit, procedural form. The town meeting, the vote, the decree, the exile of the truth-teller. Every other time Springfield ignores something it should not be able to ignore, this same mechanism is operating invisibly. The episode made the invisible mechanism visible, and the audience found it intolerable to see, which is its own kind of answer about why the mechanism usually stays hidden. The Golden Age is the period before this mechanism's visibility. The later seasons are the period after it. What the later seasons lost was the ability to depict Springfield's collective, forgetting as something the audience could participate in rather than observe from outside. Once you have seen the town vote to forget, you cannot unsee it. And once you cannot unsee it, the comedy of the forgetting is no longer quite available in the same way. The Golden Age was the show before it knew what it was doing, in the specific sense that self-knowledge is sometimes the thing that costs a comedian their timing. The later seasons are the show after it became aware of its own architecture. Both are real. Neither can be recovered from the other. Section 10. The predictions and what they actually mean. The Simpsons has predicted the future. This claim is made so frequently, in so many internet discussions and social media posts and compilation videos, that it has become a fixture of the show's public identity, second perhaps only to the characters themselves. The predictions have generated a cottage industry of content, lists, rankings, retrospectives, anniversary posts marking the distance between when the show depicted something and when that something occurred in reality. The headline examples are familiar. In the year 2000, an episode called Bart to the Future depicted a future in which Lisa Simpson had become the President of the United States. Her predecessor in the Oval Office was identified as Donald Trump. The episode aired 16 years before the 2016 election. In 1998, the show depicted a Fox Corporation acquiring a competitor studio through a merger that, at the time, appeared to be straightforward satirical comedy about media consolidation. In 2019, Disney acquired 20th Century Fox. The show had been a Fox property since its inception. The prediction that its parent network would be absorbed by the company that makes animated films was contained in an episode of an animated film that the network produced. In 1993, an episode depicted a flu virus originating from Asia spreading to cause mass panic, panic buying, and a frantic public response. This aired 27 years before 2020. In 1996, an episode featuring the hip-hop group Cypress Hill included a joke about them accidentally booking the London Symphony Orchestra while under chemical influence. In 2024, Cypress Hill performed with the London Symphony Orchestra at the Royal Albert Hall. 28 years separated the joke from its real-world occurrence. The list continues for a considerable distance. Smartwatch technology, video calling, autocorrect failures. The Higgs boson particle mass appearing in a background equation on a chalkboard. A tiger attacking one of the performers in a Siegfried and Roy-style magic act. The list of specific, dated correspondences between things the show depicted and things that subsequently occurred in reality is long enough and specific enough that even the most committed debunker has to acknowledge that something interesting is happening. The question is what that something is. The show's producers have addressed this directly, and their answer is consistent: volume and probability. Al Jean, the show's long-running executive producer, has stated it plainly: if you generate enough content across enough time, some of it will correspond to future events through sheer statistical probability. The show has produced nearly 800 episodes. Each episode contains dozens of jokes, satirical observations, and fictional events. Some fraction of those jokes, observations, and events will align with things that eventually happen in reality. The fraction does not need to be large. A small percentage of a very large number is still a substantial collection of apparent predictions. Bill Oakley, who ran the show during several of its peak seasons, put it more precisely. Many of the apparent predictions are actually predictions of trends that were already visible when the episodes were written. The writers did not predict Trump's presidency from some visionary awareness of future political events. They observed that Trump had been publicly flirting with running for office since the late 1980s, that the cultural logic of celebrity politics had been developing for decades, and they wrote a joke about the logical extension of a trend they could already see. That is not prophecy. That is perceptive observation extrapolated forward a few steps. The writers of The Simpsons have historically included people with degrees from Harvard, Yale, and other research universities, with backgrounds in mathematics, science, political theory, and economics. They are intelligent, highly educated observers of American culture who spend their careers identifying trends and pushing them to their absurd but logical conclusions. The Higgs boson equation was put there by a writer with a mathematics background who was working from the existing theoretical physics of mass prediction for undiscovered particles. He did not predict the particle's mass through intuition. He wrote down a calculation that was already available in the literature and was confirmed by experiment a decade later. The iceberg's interest in the predictions phenomenon is not in whether the predictions are real. It is in what the cultural response to the predictions reveals about the audience's relationship to the show. When a Simpsons prediction comes true, the internet's response follows a remarkably consistent pattern. Someone posts the clip circulates. The text accompanying it is some variation of, "How did they know?" The response accumulates shares and likes and comments expressing amazement and, frequently, a specific quality of unease, as though the show's apparent foreknowledge suggests something about the nature of reality itself. This response is interesting precisely because it ignores the predictions that did not come true. The Simpsons has depicted jetpacks and flying cars and moon colonies and technology that has not materialized. It has depicted political outcomes that went differently from what the show imagined. It has made jokes about cultural shifts that never happened and events that never occurred. These misses are many. The show was wrong about the future far more often than it was right. Nobody compiles the misses. Nobody circulates the clips of The Simpsons predictions that turned out to be wrong. The social media ecosystem around the predictions is built entirely from the hits, selected from the full population of predictions, hits and misses combined through confirmation bias, so comprehensive that what is left after the selection is a highlight reel that looks, to anyone encountering it without context, like evidence of something supernatural. This is how confirmation bias works. It is not a deliberate distortion. The people sharing the hits genuinely find them striking and interesting. The misses simply do not strike them as worth sharing, because misses are boring and hits are interesting, and the asymmetry in what gets shared produces an information environment in which the hits appear to be the whole of the data when they are in fact a selected fraction. The iceberg finds the meta-story, the story of what the predictions phenomenon reveals about how people engage with the show, more interesting than the predictions themselves. Because the predictions phenomenon demonstrates something specific, the show has been present in the cultural imagination long enough and deeply enough that people experience its content as having some kind of authority over reality rather than simply describing it. This is the feedback loop that the iceberg calls the show's most sophisticated long-term effect. The Simpsons has been running long enough that it is not merely a reflection of American culture. It is part of American culture's reflection of itself. When the show depicts Trump as a future president, that joke enters the cultural bloodstream and becomes part of how people think about the possibility. When the show depicts Disney absorbing Fox, that joke becomes part of how people process the logic of media consolidation. The show does not predict these things. It primes the cultural imagination to receive them. And when they arrive, they feel familiar, they feel inevitable, they feel like something we were already prepared for, because the show prepared us for them years or decades earlier. Springfield did not predict America. Springfield became part of how America understands itself, and that understanding shaped what America was willing to accept and expect and eventually produce. The joke preceded the reality, and the joke's precedence made the reality feel, when it arrived, less like a shock than like a punchline. That is not prophecy. It is influence operating at a scale and across a time span that most cultural products never achieve. And it is, ultimately, a stranger and more interesting thing than prophecy. Section 11: The Floating Timeline and the Loop We Built. Nobody in Springfield ages. We have established this. But it is worth returning to it from a different angle, from the bottom of the iceberg rather than from the developmental and theoretical angles we have already examined, because at this depth, The floating timeline looks like something different from what it looks like at the surface. At the surface, the floating timeline is a production convention. Characters stay at fixed ages because the show needs them to. Easy. At the iceberg level, the floating timeline is the show's thesis statement about what the audience needs from it. Consider what it would mean if The Simpsons were allowed to age. Not in a flash-forward episode, not in a special, but in the actual run of the series. Bart turns 11, then 12. The skateboard gradually becomes less cool and more nostalgic, and eventually it goes into a closet and doesn't come out again. Lisa turns 9, 10, 12, 15, and the show has to follow her through the developmental stages that turn a brilliant, isolated, idealistic child into whatever an adult with that specific origin story becomes. Homer and Marge age into their 40s, their 50s. The show has to contend with what a marriage looks like across those decades. Maggie starts to talk, then to walk, then to go to school, then to have her own perspective that is no longer legible as a baby's mysterious potential, but is the specific, demanding, ordinary perspective of a growing child becoming a person. All of this is possible. The show has proven, in flash-forward episodes and in the occasional episode that commits to a developmental moment with unusual honesty, that it has the tools to do this. It knows what adult Lisa looks like. It knows what an aging Homer and Marge look like. The knowledge is there. The tools are there. The show has consistently declined to use them in any sustained way, and the audience has never seriously demanded that it do so. This is the observation that the iceberg holds at its deepest level, the one that points outward from Springfield into the real world. The audience does not want The Simpsons to age. The audience has, across 36 years of watching, developed a relationship with the frozen characters that requires the freezing. Bart at 10 is a reference point. He is the age he was when many viewers first encountered him, and that age has become a kind of fixed point in their personal histories. To age Bart would be to disturb something that the audience has built its engagement with the show around. The frozen Bart is not just a production convenience. He is a necessity produced by the audience's relationship to him. This is the loop that the iceberg identifies at the bottom of the whole structure. The audience built the freezing. The show maintains it on behalf of the audience. The characters are frozen because we need them to be frozen. We need them to be frozen because they represent something that we cannot afford to let age. What do they represent? The most obvious answer is that they represent a specific moment in American family life that is now historical. The Simpsons, when it began in 1989, was depicting a version of the American middle class that the people watching it recognized from their own lives or their parents' lives. The nuclear family in the house on the street in the town, managing on one income, worried about the same things. That version of American middle-class life has since changed in ways that are significant and in many cases painful. The economic conditions that made Homer's life at the plant feel like a stable baseline rather than a precarious perch have shifted. The family structure has diversified. The town's role as the center of community life has eroded. The specific texture of the American middle-class experience that The Simpsons began by depicting is now, at least partly, historical, and the characters are frozen in 1989's version of that texture. Bart is 10 in 1989. Lisa is 8 in 1989. Homer works at the plant in 1989. The cultural references around them update, the technology in the background changes, but the essential situation, the family, the town, the plant, the couch, is the situation of 1989. The audience watches this in 2025, and something in the watching is consolatory. Not nostalgic exactly, not a longing to return to 1989, but something related to that longing. A relationship with a version of the American family that has been preserved intact, that has not changed, that will be exactly what it was when you come back to it next week. In a world where most things change faster than people can adjust to the changes, this is not nothing. The show is the loop is the show. And the audience built the loop by continuing to watch across 36 years of never quite letting the characters out of the amber. The coma theory holds that Homer built the loop. His unconscious mind generates the same family, in the same house, at the same ages, because it is the only version of his family he can access. And because the access is the only thing preventing the dream from ending, and Homer from having to face whatever waits on the other side of waking up. The iceberg suggests that the coma theory is a metaphor as much as it is a theory. We are all Homer in this sense. We have all been watching the same family age toward zero change while the world outside their house has continued to become harder to recognize. And we keep watching because the loop, whatever its cost to the characters frozen within it, is something we need. That is the bottom of the iceberg, not a revelation, an admission. Springfield is preserved because we preserve it. The family is frozen because we need them frozen. The loop runs because we keep running it. And every Sunday at 8, or whenever the algorithm presents it, or in whatever moment you find yourself pressing play, you are doing what the audience has always done. Stepping into Springfield, accepting the yellow and the four fingers and the cooling towers and the fish with three eyes and the town that forgets everything, and finding, in all of that impossible familiarity, something that feels enough like home to be worth returning to. The iceberg goes all the way down to that, to the fact that the mystery of Springfield is also the mystery of why we keep going back. And the answer at the bottom is that we go back because something in the show knows what we need, and what we need is the family on the couch, still there, still together, still intact after everything. That is enough. That has always been enough. Section 12, Marge, the women of Springfield, and the cost of holding everything together. Marge Simpson is the show's load-bearing wall. Every structure, narrative, and domestic that the show is built around leans against her. Without her patience, Homer's chaos becomes genuinely destructive rather than merely comedic. Without her management, the household fails. Without her attention, the children drift. Without her presence, 742 Evergreen Terrace is a different show about a different family. She is also, across 36 seasons and more than 780 episodes, one of the most comprehensively underexplored central characters in the history of American television. The iceberg is not interested in arguing that Marge has been given no material. She has had good episodes. The gambling episode, where the show depicts her addiction with genuine care for the specific texture of how that particular addiction works, the way it offers something that belongs entirely to her, that exists outside the domestic space she otherwise never escapes, that fills the specific gap left by a life in which most of what she does is for someone else. The painting episode, where Marge discovers artistic capability and briefly experiences the specific satisfaction of being seen for something that is hers, rather than something she has done for another person. The episodes where her anxiety manifests physically, and the show is forced to acknowledge that the management of everything has a cost. These exist. What the iceberg holds is the pattern that surrounds them, the consistent return to the counter, the pearls, the blue hair, the management role. Every time the show gives Marge a window into a fuller version of herself, it closes that window by the end of the episode and returns her to the position she holds. The gambling ends. The painting is set aside, the anxiety is managed. Marge is back at the counter, capable, patient, holding the structure in place. The show has never sustained the full version of Marge for more than an episode, because sustaining it would require the show to do something that would fundamentally alter its relationship to Homer and the children. It would require acknowledging, at a structural level rather than in a single episode that gets reset, that the management Marge provides is not free, that someone is paying for it, specifically, and that person is Marge. Patty and Selma Bouvier, Marge's sisters, are the characters the show deploys to acknowledge this without actually reckoning with it. They are cigarettes and pessimism and a settled, comprehensive, accurate assessment of Homer Simpson that the show renders as comedy rather than as the correct read of the situation that it actually is. Patty and Selma are right about Homer. They have been right about Homer for 36 years. Their accuracy is the source of their comedy in the show's economy. But the iceberg notices that being right about Homer as a punchline is different from being right about Homer as a perspective the show endorses. The show lets them be right in a register that permits the audience to find their rightness funny rather than requiring them to sit with the implications of rightness. Edna Krabappel was the secondary female character who came closest to full realization in the show's run. Her exhaustion was specific. Her capacity for warmth, buried under layers of professional disappointment and personal history, was depicted with genuine care in the episodes that looked at her directly, rather than using her as a Bart antagonist. Her marriage to Ned Flanders was the show attempting something genuinely interesting. A pairing of two people, both of whom had been through enough to have lost most of their easy expectations, finding each other on the other side of that loss. And then Marcia Wallace, who had voiced Edna for the entirety of the show's run, died in 2013. The show retired the character rather than recast her. The acknowledgement was a chalkboard gag in Bart's handwriting. "We will miss you, Mrs. K." It was brief. It was the show's way of doing what the show knows how to do when it is being honest. Say the true thing plainly, in the smallest possible space, and let the weight of what it means do the rest. The women of Springfield, taken across the whole of what the show has built, form a portrait of constrained capacity. They are more observant than the men around them. They absorb more consequences. They manage more, with less acknowledgement, for longer. And the show has spent 36 years finding this arrangement both funny and, in its most honest episodes, genuinely troubling. The rarity of the honest episodes is its own data point about the distance between what the show knows and what it is willing to sustain. Closing what we brought back from the bottom. We have covered a great deal of ground tonight, the yellow skin that marks a contaminated population without saying so. The nuclear plant and its 342 violations, and its sleeping safety inspector. The company town economics that ensure nobody leaves. The children frozen at the ages where their archetypes are most useful. The coma that may have begun in 1993 and produced every improbable episode since. The secondary cast and the buried depth of Barney's potential and Ned's conditioning and Bob's frustrated intelligence. The architecture of Homer's pain and the woman who built it and the man who burned her out. The Golden Age and what its ending revealed about what the age had been. The predictions that are really the story of influence rather than prophecy. The floating timeline that the audience built and maintains. At the bottom of all of this, the iceberg holds a simple thing. The Simpsons is a show about a family that stays together. That is its most fundamental description. Not a satire, not a cartoon, not a pop culture monument, not a 36-year cultural document about American life, though it is all of those things too. A show about a family that stays together. The system around them does not support this. The system around them is, in the iceberg reading, actively organized against it. The contaminated environment, the exploitative employment, the corrupt government, the indifferent institutions, the collective amnesia that prevents the community from protecting itself from any of the forces that have been working against it since the first episode. And the family stays together anyway. On the couch, at the table, on Evergreen Terrace, in the impossible town that can't be found on a map, in the loop that the audience built around them, because the loop is the only thing that keeps the family exactly where they were the last time we needed them to be there. That is what you have been watching. That is what we found at the bottom. The couch gag plays. Homer comes through the door. The family assembles. You can close your eyes now. Springfield will be exactly where you left it. It always is. Thank you for spending this time going deep. If this helped you drift off or gave you something quiet to think about at the end of your day, the kindest thing you can do is subscribe. We go this deep regularly. There is always more iceberg. There is always more Springfield. And there is always more worth finding. If you are willing to go slowly enough to find it, good night.